Hey folks, so I wanted to post a video to cover a couple of things. Firstly, I wanted to remind you that tomorrow we will be composing our final short writing assignment on Medusa and on the poetry of Plath and May Sarton, who we are currently discussing in this final discussion forum. So that will be tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. As I said in my notes, you can be a little bit strategic about completing this last assignment. If you've completed the other two short writing assignments, you're happy with your grades, this might be one that you want to forego completing, as I will drop your lowest score. However, if you missed a previous short writing assignment or aren't satisfied with the other two grades that you have, then this is certainly one that you will want to complete. And again, I will be averaging your highest two scores, dropping your lowest score to calculate your final grade specifically for the short writing assignments. So keep that in mind for tomorrow. I also want to just talk through Medusa as a character and also Medusa as a really important figure, mythological figure who has been co-opted and reclaimed in a lot of ways for feminist scholars and feminist writers. I've given you two scholarly articles, one by Karen Elias Button, and also one by the French theorist, feminist, novelist, screenwriter Hélène Cixous, to provide a little bit of critical context when considering the figure of Medusa, considering the symbolism that she has come to represent for modern feminist writers and thinkers and poets, and also provide us with a way in which we can then consider these two different poems that we are reading now, Sarton's poem and Plath's poem, who engage with the Medusa figure and utilize the Medusa figure, I would argue, in different ways. So just to briefly, by no means are you expected to understand and fully process the ins and outs of the two scholarly essays. I just want to review a couple of I would say the key main points from both essays, so that you can kind of use them as a lens to then consider the poems, since they do seem to be wrestling with the Medusa figure in important but potentially different ways. So for Cixous, her project for this particular essay, and generally in her work, is to really try to encourage women to write themselves into the lexicon of history, of mythology. She refers to men as myth makers. And what she means by that is that language itself, history itself, the recording of history itself, has been a sort of male-dominated field. Language itself is a male-dominated construct. And because of this fact, women's experiences, she refers to women's bodies, women's sexualities, women's complexities, have been represented by men, as opposed to, represented by men in ways that don't pose any real threats to the male ego and to male power. And so her sort of battle cry in this essay is that women need to write themselves into language. She refers to women's writing specifically as a form of, she refers to it as like white ink. She's really kind of calling forth richer experiences of women, the representation of women in more realistic, complicated ways, the presentation of women's needs and sexuality and desires to be um, sort of inked alongside the masculine experience, which is often described as kind of or considered to be like the common experience or the typical experience. This certainly does not always include a particularly female experience. And so this is something that she uh, really tries to um, push as a new form of philosophy, really. And she utilizes Medusa in an interesting and specific way. You know, she calls to mind, as we see in mythology, in this particular myth, that most commonly Medusa is viewed as this monster figure. We talked a little bit in our last forum about how, you know, females in mythology are often, you know, sort of categorized as either these sort of like weak damsels in distress or as monsters. She refers to Medusa as being presented as this castrating woman. What she means by that is that, you know, Medusa is presented as someone who can obviously turn men to stone and kill men. And so Medusa's power seems to usurp that of men in this particular myth. So she sort of calls upon this traditional presentation of Medusa as this castrating woman, and she kind of reappropriates her. She sort of revises her to be more of this powerful, laughing, joyful, loving sort of symbolic mother figure to give birth to future generations of women to write their own experiences into myths, into history. And she refers, you know, back to the original roots of mythology, which was based on more of a matriarchal system before it was supplanted by a more patriarchal system in valuing masculine power over female power, right? I mean, the presentation or representation of a woman as a mother has a lot of power, right? The ability to give birth has historically been associated with, you know, this almost divine power. But again, over time, and we talked about this right at the beginning of the semester when we were really delving into our creation myths of this shift from the matriarchal to a patriarchal system. And so Sixu really kind of tries to call upon Medusa as this mythological figure that has the ability to inspire creative renewal and power and authority in women. And I think that Sarton's poem is utilizing the Medusa figure more in this particular way of calling upon Medusa not as one who is this terrible monster, but more as one whose power and authority is actually quite invigorating, is actually quite inspiring for Sarton. Sarton was, you know, born in 1912 and was an eventually openly gay poet during a time when, you know, being a homosexual wasn't the quote unquote norm. And so I think you can see Sarton sort of wrestling with herself and representing herself honestly and with all of her own sort of complexities and not feeling a sense of censorship or not feeling a sense of shame. You know, at the end she says, "I turn your face around," talking about Medusa. It is my face. So she feels a real symmetry and connection to to Medusa. And then she talks about that frozen rage is what I must explore. This anger that she feels from having to be represented in certain ways that were not true to herself, what she felt was true to herself. And the anger that has stemmed from that is something that she feels she needs to unpack and explore. And it's important that she also talks at the beginning of the poem about how, the poet looks Medusa directly in the eye, but doesn't turn to stone. She was not punished, she says. And then also calls into question how to believe the legends I am told. Well, how am I supposed to believe in Medusa as this terrible monster, this castrating female, someone to be afraid of, to want to distance oneself from as a woman because of all of these negatively charged representations of her? Well, how am I supposed to believe in these legends when I'm looking her directly in the eye and I'm not being punished? It's important that Sarton is a female, and Medusa is a figure who is punishing of males, or has the ability to turn men to stone, and obviously kill men. So Sarton too, I think, is taking up Cixous's call to arms a little bit in representing herself, working to utilize Medusa as a conduit to represent herself more honestly, more truly, and more boldly in writing. So I want us to sort of use Cixous as kind of a lens to view Sarton's poem. I think Cixous is also valuable when thinking through Plath's poem as well, but I think Plath's poem, and this is what Elias Button really sort of takes up in her essay. Elias Button also talks about Medusa as the castrating female, but she looks at her too as the kind of terrible mother. Elias Button is a little bit more concerned with specifically the mother-daughter connection and the mother-daughter bond. And also kind of calls to arms women, particularly female poets, contemporary female poets, to resurrect Medusa as well, not as necessarily this terrible, grasping mother, but also as a representation of power and authority and creative renewal. So Elias Button sort of splits Medusa and kind of considers her in two different ways. Firstly, as the sort of grasping mother. And what she means by that, and what we really can see playing out in Plath's poem, is this kind of deranged relationship between mother and daughter, in this obsessive need to join with the mother, but also this sort of anger towards the mother and the desire to sever a relationship with the mother. So the grasping mother, for Elias Button, she talks about how, in the 19th century, women were more limited in terms of what they could do with their lives. So there was more of a natural, emotional, biological connection between mothers and daughters, and among women themselves. And mothers sort of served as almost, or daughters served almost as like apprentices to mothers in learning how to fulfill their roles as wives and mothers. And then she talks about how for more contemporary, more 20th century, 21st century mother-daughter relationships, how now that there are, and especially for Westerners, how there are so many more opportunities now for daughters, and how women now have more access to power. And so the relationship between mother and daughter is much more complicated and can be sort of pathological if the identities of the mother and daughter are so intertwined with one another that neither can really sever from one another in a healthy way and be independent in terms of their own identities. Therein lies a kind of trauma and therein lies a kind of complex, unresolved relationship with the mother. She ties this a little bit, and Cixous does as well, ties this a little bit into psychoanalytic theory, which I'm not going to, go into all of that. But the most important part of psychoanalytic theory that they both sort of touch on when talking about the grasping mother or the terrible mother is the Electra complex, which happens during the sort of, if you're familiar with a little man named Sigmund Freud, a little Austrian psychoanalyst. This is something that occurs during the phallic stage. So when children are 3 to I think like 5 or 6 years old, where for daughters they have this sort of brief period where they desire their father and experience what Freud calls penis envy. This is a very like underdeveloped theory, by the way, and a lot of like modern psychoanalysts like kind of poo-poo this. And it's much less complicated than the Oedipus complex, which is the sort of parallel complex for boys. But for daughters, they briefly desire their father. They gain penis envy, not just because they want like a penis, but because the phallus is actually the universal signifier, the representative of power and authority. And so when little girls realize they don't have this, they feel castrated and they blame their mother, who also lacks a penis. And the way in which this is resolved is that eventually the daughter stops desiring the father and kind of reemerges with the mother in order to then fulfill her gender role. In a nutshell, that's sort of what it is. So Cixous and also Elias Button, when talking about the grasping mother, the terrible mother, they're sort of drawing from the Electra complex to some extent, that there is all of these sort of complex, desires among daughters to break free of the mother, break free of the mother's body, which is seen as a kind of sanctuary of sorts, and to be able to access power and access authority that the father, capital F, father, represents in society, in culture at large. So these are some of the tensions that Elias Button sort of outlines in her essay, and she also talks about the creative powers of Medusa, if Medusa can be sort of reconceptualized as a model for power and for authority. She tries to move away from Medusa as the symbol of the sort of castrating female in desiring a more patriarchal inheritance of power, and trying to sort of equally promote this other sort of theory of Medusa as representing not the grasping mother, but a sort of powerful authority in and of herself, again, that can sort of inspire creative energies in women to sort of claim their own power and, again, represent themselves more clearly and honestly in literature and in writing, and specifically in writing. So in Plath's poem, by the way, Plath is one of the most well-known poets of the 20th century. Both she and Sarton are sort of Boston girls. They were raised in Boston, Massachusetts. Plath was born a little bit later, in 1932, and she was doing a lot of her writing in the 50s. Plath herself was sort of the victim of being kind of overshadowed by a sort of male authority figure. Firstly, she lost her father when she was very young. He was a professor, a beekeeper, and she writes a lot about the severance from her father. She writes about her father as this larger-than-life figure. She co-opts quite frequently in her poetry the image of her father as different prominent mythological figures, like Poseidon, for example. I don't know if any of you have read her poem Daddy, but Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through is how it ends. And this is another sort of way in which she uses her poetry to kind of work through some of the tensions that she feels around, her father being this sort of larger than life and also unattainable figure. Kind of can see the Electra complex kind of happening a lot in her writing about her father. She also married an English poet, Ted Hughes, who at the time, it's funny, now Plath is, better known than Hughes in a lot of ways, or is considered a more superior poet. But at the time, she was living in England. She was on a Fulbright scholarship. She met Ted Hughes. He was this prominent English proper poet. And he was the more, successful, well-published poet during their relationship. And they had 2 children together, and she was trying to write while dealing with her own experiences of motherhood and feeling the sort of injustice of, being tethered to the home and her children as a poet, while her husband was off teaching and writing and getting all of this acclaim and attention. She did publish during her lifetime. Her collection, The Colossus, came out. And a lot of the poems that she wrote in the late 50s were collected in a collection called Ariel, which is probably her best-known collection, which was published posthumously by Hughes, along with her collected poems. She won a Pulitzer Prize posthumously. She was the first person to ever win a Pulitzer posthumously for her writing. So Plath is a poet who really takes up the sort of mythological prototypes and constructs in a lot of her poems, and Medusa is no exception. In this particular poem, she writes about the complicated relationship she has with her mother, Aurelia Plath. It's important to know when she was writing this poem, Aurelia was living back in Massachusetts. Plath was living in England at the time with her family. So when she uses some imagery like the Atlantic cable, she's really talking about being separated by an ocean from her mother. There's a lot of religious imagery in this poem, which is interesting. She says dragging their Jesus hair, a communion wafer, a ghastly Vatican. There's also some really clear markings of the sort of the maternal in this, when she talks about a placenta, a barnacled umbilicus. So in this poem, and I don't want to just totally unpack it because I want to give you all the opportunity to do that yourselves, but I do want to provide this kind of context for you to think through how Elias Button is utilizing the term of the grasping mother, of the pathology of the relationship between mother and daughter, of the inability for the both of them to separate enough in order to sort of promote and develop their own independent identities from one another. Plath is really wrestling with that in this particular poem. So keep that in mind when you're going through, because this is a challenging poem. I would definitely be reading both of the poems out loud. I would be reading them slowly. I would be rereading them and really trying to kind of unpack them one stanza at a time as you're going through. And again, utilize the 2 essays just as some scholarly critical context to just enhance your reading and understanding of Medusa as both a sort of mythological figure and also an incredibly viable, important, symbolic figure, again, in the contemporary feminist movement, and how she is being utilized specifically by these 2 poets as a symbol for sort of the grasping mother, and also as a symbol for some sort of creative renewal and authority. Okay, so I wanted to provide you with that. Um, Definitely watch this before you write your short writing assignment tomorrow. I hope it gives you a little bit more footing as you work through the poetry and as you work through the essays. And if you have questions, raise them in our forums so that we can kind of collectively unpack these poems together. Of course, you could always email me as well. Okay, signing off for now. Bye. Happy reading.